A soldier walked into his own funeral service in 1889 London during the choir hymn. London in 1889 was a city of fog, gas lamps, and endless clatter. Rain-slicked streets reflected the dim glow of lamps, turning every puddle into a mirror of the gloomy sky. That morning, a somber mood hung over a small parish church in Whitechapel. Inside, black velvet drapes were drawn, and a wooden coffin rested at the center, flowers piled high around it. The townsfolk whispered prayers, their faces etched with grief, their eyes fixed on the polished oak that held the man they believed lost forever. Outside, the air was thick, almost heavy with sorrow. Children peeked from behind shutters. Women clutched handkerchiefs, and men tipped hats solemnly. Everyone knew the soldier. He had marched in parades, delivered letters home to loved ones, and fought in battles that had cost countless lives. And now, the same man, once the pride of London's East End, had been declared dead. The service began. The choir's hymns cut through the silence of a church like a knife. Voices trembled with emotion, and the organ groaned with the weight of loss. Each note seemed to hang in the air, almost as if time itself had stopped. Mourners leaned in, holding their breath as the vicar spoke of duty, honor, and a sacrifice. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a mournful visitor hiding the city from itself. Then the doors creaked. At first, people thought it was a draft, the wind slipping through the heavy oak. But the sound repeated, slower this time, deliberate. A figure appeared, tall and uniformed, framed in the fog glass. Silence fell. The choir faltered mid him. Gas lamps flickered as if sensing the shock inside. It was him, the soldier, alive. Every eye widened, every mouth fell open. He walked slowly down the aisle, boots clicking against the cold stone floor. Some froze in disbelief, others gasped in terror. Mothers covered their children's eyes, fathers muttered prayers. No one moved. The soldier's face was pale but unmistakable. His uniform was worn, patched, and drenched from the morning drizzle, but every medal and ribbon told the story of battle survived. Whispers began to ripple through the church. It can't be. He's dead. How is this possible? The vicar dropped his sermon notes. His hands shook, and the organist's fingers stuttered over the keys. It was chaos contained in the hush of the church walls. The soldier reached the front, standing above his own coffin. He looked down at it, not with fear, but with a strange detachment, as if seeing himself from a distance. He had been reported dead after a skirmish in France, a mistake that had been cemented by paperwork, witnesses, and the telegram that had traveled miles to declare his passing. But here he was, alive, standing in the midst of mourning he hadn't anticipated. For the congregation, it was a moment of disbelief and horror intertwined. Flowers seemed suddenly meaningless. Candles flickered like ghosts. The choir stopped mid-verse, their notes hanging in the air, unfinished. London had planned a farewell that would never have happened, and yet it had, without the one who belonged to it. Some say the soldier never spoke that day. Others claim he whispered a single word, almost inaudible over the organ, alive. And for a brief moment, the city held its breath, caught between life and death, truth and rumor, grief and shock. The rest of the day passed in a daze. Neighbors told stories that would echo for decades. Children asked if ghosts could attend funerals. And somewhere in the fog outside, a man who should have been dead simply walked away, leaving a city to reconcile with the impossible. In the quiet corners of London's military offices, there existed a rigid, almost sacred ritual, the death ledger. Bound in worn leather, its pages carried names of soldiers, their ages, their regiments, and the circumstances of their passing. It was meticulous work, the sort that left no room for error, or so they thought. On a damp morning in March 1889, Private Thomas Avery's name was entered into that ledger. His signature, or rather his absence, was marked with a small, black ink cross, a mark that would ripple far beyond the walls of the office. To the clerks, it was a routine task: confirm a casualty, update records, notify the family. But in Thomas's case, it was a lie waiting to unravel. The telegram had arrived from the front lines in France. Brief, factual, and cold. Private Thomas Avery reported Kia. Body not recovered. Offer condolences. Officers assumed it was true. After all, battles left chaos in their wake. Letters could be lost. Bodies could vanish beneath mud and fire. Yet, the ledger accepted it as truth. Thomas Avery existed in two realities: the dusty streets of London, alive and breathing, and a single line in a ledger, forever dead. Back home, his family had already received the grim news. His mother clutched the telegram as though it were both proof and punishment. Her hands trembled, ink smudging the words she could not believe. His father wore black, silent and rigid, while his younger siblings avoided his eyes. Neighbors brought flowers, whispered condolences, and bowed their heads. The ledger had spoken. The city mourned. The man himself, however, had survived a skirmish that left him battered, exhausted, and stranded behind enemy lines. For weeks, Thomas had struggled to return to England. The journey was perilous, footsteps through forests, hiding from patrols, riding trains where tickets were impossible to acquire. Each mile brought him closer to home, yet the thought of his own funeral haunted him. Did they already bury him? Would his mother see him again? The ledger had not only written him dead, it had shaped reality for everyone who loved him. By the time he reached London, whispers of his demise had spread through the neighborhood. In the pub, men spoke of him as a memory. Children repeated tales of the soldier who had fallen bravely. And the church, draped in black, waited for the mourners who would pay their last respects. Walking down those fog-laden streets, Thomas noticed how ordinary life continued despite his supposed death. Horses clattered over cobblestones, vendors shouted over the market, and children splashed in puddles as if nothing had happened. Yet, each face he passed carried a shadow of grief meant for him. The ledger had cast a spell that made him invisible in plain sight. When he finally arrived at the church, he saw the ledger's power manifested in full. The coffin at the altar, the flowers arranged in solemn bouquets, the choir mid him. The weight of being written dead, of existing only in ink and memory, pressed against him. Every step toward the doors was a confrontation with disbelief, not just his own, but that of an entire city. Inside, the congregation held its breath. Mourners had already shed tears for him. Now, the ledger would be confronted by reality. The line that had declared his life over would be erased, not with ink, but with presence. Thomas Avery had returned, a living contradiction, walking among those who had learned to grieve him. The ledger's pages, once sacred and absolute, would never feel the same again. It arrived on a gray morning, carried by a courier through slick streets and misted alleyways. The envelope was simple, unassuming, yet inside it held words that would change lives forever. The telegram that reached Thomas Avery's family was brief, precise, and absolute. Private Thomas Avery reported killed in action. Body not recovered. Offer condolences. At first, his mother could not read it. She stared at the printed letters as if they might rearrange themselves into a kinder truth. His father snatched the paper from her hands, jaw tight, lips pressed together. He did not speak, for words could not make sense of a world in which a son could die far away, in a land soaked with blood and mud, and yet still remain a part of the family he left behind. The telegram was meant to be a formality, an administrative confirmation of a soldier's fate. But in Thomas's case, it became a sentence. The chaos of war had obscured reality. A skirmish in France, a battlefield littered with bodies, confusion, and smoke. Reports were hurried, and someone in the distance assumed the worst. The truth, the fact that Thomas had survived, remained buried beneath mountains of miscommunication, ignored documents, and exhausted clerks. In London, preparations for the funeral began almost immediately. Black crepe was draped across windows. Friends and neighbors whispered prayers for a man they had seen only days before. The choir rehearsed hymns, voices trembling as they practiced for a service that should never have been necessary. The telegram had set wheels in motion that could not easily be stopped. Thomas, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle. Weeks after the skirmish, he navigated broken roads and hostile towns, avoiding soldiers who assumed he was a deserter or a ghost. Each step was heavy with fear, each breath a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Letters home had been lost. He had no way to warn anyone of his survival. The telegram had already arrived, sealing his fate before he could return. When he finally neared London, the city seemed alive and dead at the same time. Life went on in marketplaces and pubs, yet his family had already begun mourning him as if his absence were permanent. Children who once played by the docks now whispered of the brave soldier who would never return. Neighbors nodded solemnly to his parents, carrying the weight of condolences they believed genuine. The telegram had done its work. It made reality bend around a single sentence. The church doors loomed ahead, black velvet curtains swaying with the damp breeze. Inside, the coffin gleamed under candlelight. Flowers and wreaths smelled faintly of roses and lilacs, their scent almost suffocating. The choir, mid-hymn, could not see him, yet felt a presence that would soon unmake their understanding of death. The telegram had promised an ending, but life had other plans. As Thomas pushed open the heavy doors, gas lamps flickered, shadows dancing along stone walls. Every eye in the church turned. Mothers clutched children, men stiffened in their seats, and the vicar froze mid-sermon. The words of the telegram hung over the congregation like a dark cloud, now challenged by a living, breathing man who should have been gone. The telegram had been simple, administrative, and cold, yet it carried the power to shape grief, manipulate perception, and nearly erase a life. But nothing could contain Thomas Avery. Nothing could undo the pulse of a man who had survived the impossible, walking into a world that had already written him off. In that moment, the city understood that words on paper, no matter how official, could not bind the living to death. The church smelled of candle wax, damp wood, and the faint perfume of lilies. Shadows clung to the corners like silent witnesses. Every pew was filled with relatives and neighbors who had come to mourn a man already lost to the world, or so they believed. Black dresses, black coats, black veils. London had dressed itself in grief. Thomas Avery's mother sat at the front, her hands trembling over her lap, clutching a handkerchief stained with tears. Her eyes, red and swollen, were fixed on the coffin. She whispered prayers under her breath, words meant to summon peace, but her heart thumped violently with confusion she could not yet name. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, rehearsing grief that now hung in the air like a tangible fog. Behind her, the choir's voices trembled. They had practiced the hymns day after day, preparing for a farewell that should have been solemn, quiet, final. But even their trained voices shook as they sang, each note bending under the weight of sorrow. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across polished wood, reflecting grief in motion. It was as if the very building mourned alongside the congregation. His father, rigid as stone, stood near the back. His face betrayed nothing, yet his hands gripped the edge of a pew so tightly the knuckles whitened. He had spoken little since receiving the telegram, allowing the city to whisper condolences for a man they had all known. Every clap of the organ, every quiver in the choir's voices, reminded him of a life he believed had ended too soon. The service progressed. Speeches were made of honor, sacrifice, and bravery. Stories were told of Thomas's courage on distant battlefields. Each tale struck the congregation like a hammer, shaping grief into communal mourning. The sound of sobs, heavy and steady, filled the air between the organ's notes. Time moved slowly, each tick of the clock echoing in the ears of those who had already said goodbye to a man they still loved. And then it began, a shift in the air, subtle at first. The heavy oak doors at the entrance of the church creaked ever so slightly. The choir's notes wavered mid-hymn, the organist faltering with a missed key. eyes turned, seeking the source of the disturbance. A figure appeared in the doorway, damp from the London drizzle, uniform soaked, boots echoing against stone floors. It was him, Thomas Avery, alive. Mothers gasped, clutching their children, hiding faces behind veils. Fathers blinked, mouths opening and closing without sound. Choir members froze, voices caught mid-note, trembling in disbelief. The coffin sat at the front, untouched yet meaningless. Flowers seemed suddenly futile, their petals fragile against the weight of shock. Every face in the church had been transformed by the impossible. Thomas walked down the aisle slowly, boots clicking in rhythmic defiance of every expectation. His eyes met his mother's first, wide and uncomprehending. Her hands fell from her lap as if gravity had abandoned them. He looked at his father next, who finally exhaled, a mixture of relief and disbelief escaping him in a single shuddering breath. The choir's trembling grew into silence. The organ stilled, the congregation suspended in a moment of absolute impossibility. Time itself seemed to pause, allowing the city to witness a miracle stitched together by war, error, and the stubborn persistence of life. In that instant, black veils, somber hymns, and grief-drenched pews became irrelevant. For the family, the soldier had returned. For the choir, a hymn remained unfinished. And for London, a story of life, death, and impossible return had begun to be told. A story that would echo for decades, whispered in foggy streets and candlelit churches. The heavy oak doors groaned under their own weight, as if protesting against the presence that crossed their threshold. Every inch Thomas Avery pushed them open, the sound reverberated through the church, mingling with the fading hymn and the soft rustle of mourning garments. Gas lamps flickered in response, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across the stone walls. It was a sound the congregation could not place at first. An intruder? A ghost? As Thomas stepped inside, the air seemed to thicken. Candle flames wavered, casting light that felt uncertain, as though it feared the impossible reality before it. Every eye turned toward him. Mothers clutched children, whispers rose to shocked gasps, and fathers' hands shook against the wooden pews. The choir froze mid-note, their voices caught between disbelief and fear. And yet, he walked slowly, deliberately, a living contradiction moving among the mourners. The soldier's uniform was soaked, patched, and worn from weeks of hardship, yet every medal and ribbon gleamed faintly under the flickering candlelight. His boots struck the stone floor with a rhythm that echoed like the tolling of a bell, announcing life where death had been declared. In his hands, he carried nothing, yet the weight of his presence filled the church more than any coffin ever could. Some whispered that he moved like a ghost, gliding between pews, his eyes scanning the faces that had mourned him. Others claimed he paused, almost reverently, before the coffin, looking down as if seeing himself for the first time from another perspective. The polished wood, the flowers, the neatly arranged wreaths. They were all symbols of a grief that had been premature. He had returned to challenge the city's understanding of life and death. The vicar, white-faced and trembling, tried to speak, but no words formed. Every sermon, every prayer, every scripture read for the occasion became suddenly meaningless. The congregation's grief had been real, genuine, and yet now it hovered in an impossible state, suspended between mourning and astonishment. Thomas's mother broke the spell first. She rose, stumbling forward, hand outstretched as though to touch what she feared might vanish again. Her tears fell freely now, mixing relief with disbelief, shaking her to her core. Her husband's stoicism cracked moments later, shoulders sagging, a sigh escaping that carried years of pent-up tension and sorrow. The choir remained silent, the organ idle, the hymns unfinished, yet somehow the silence was more powerful than any song. Outside, London's fog pressed against the church windows like a spectator of the miraculous. It crept along the walls, curling in corners, and seemed to frame the moment as something sacred beyond explanation. Those present could feel it. The city itself had paused to witness the impossible. A man, thought dead, walking into his own funeral. No one dared approach immediately. Thomas moved with deliberate calm, as though he alone understood the enormity of what had occurred. Each step seemed measured, each breath careful. Yet despite the shock and fear, a strange warmth spread among the mourners. Life had returned, and with it, a fragile hope that nothing, even the cruel hand of fate, was final. The event would be whispered in London for years. Passers-by in foggy streets would speak of a soldier who returned to witness his own farewell. Choirs would recount a hymn left unfinished. Families would tell of disbelief turned to joy in the span of a heartbeat. And the church doors, those ancient, heavy doors, would forever be remembered as the gateway between death and life, a threshold crossed by a man who refused to be written out of the world. For a moment, the church became a place outside of time. Faces turned pale, eyes widened, mouths opened without sound. Candles flickered violently, shadows stretching like dark fingers across the stone walls. Every mourner seemed to exist in a suspended reality, caught between the grief they had prepared for and the impossible presence before them. Children clung to mothers' skirts, peeking with wide, fearful eyes at the man who had been declared dead. Fathers gripped pews for support, some murmuring prayers, others shaking their heads as if willing the vision to vanish. The choir, frozen mid-hymn, exchanged glances that spoke of disbelief so profound it threatened to undo their sense of sound itself. Thomas Avery's mother stood trembling, her hand reaching instinctively toward him. Her fingers brushed his sleeve, and in that instant, the fog of fear and sorrow lifted just enough to reveal the depth of relief and joy she had buried. Tears streaked her cheeks, flowing freely now, carrying months of grief in their wake. Her husband, silent and stoic until this point, finally exhaled, shoulders sagging as though a weight he had carried for weeks had been lifted. The soldier moved slowly, deliberately, through the aisle. Every step echoed like a drumbeat of life over death, reality over illusion. Boots clicked against the stone floor, reverberating through the church and striking fear and awe into every heart present. The congregation could not look away. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered incomprehensible words, barely audible over the silence. The coffin remained at the altar, still polished and adorned with wreaths. It was a reminder of a grief that had been meticulously prepared, yet now seemed absurd. The flowers, carefully arranged by hands that had mourned him, wilted slightly in the shock of a life returned. The black velvet drapes and the solemnity of the day no longer matched the reality before them. Life had intruded upon death, reshaping the very air they breathed. Even the choir, whose voices had faltered at the sight of him, found themselves caught in an unspoken reverence. The hymn was unfinished, yet it lingered in the air, heavy with emotion, an echo of mourning transformed into wonder. Candles flickered as if nodding, shadows bending and twisting in acknowledgement of a truth that defied reason. Neighbors who had come to mourn whispered to each other, faces pale as marble. Children's lips trembled as they asked their parents if this was real. Mothers clutched their children tighter, whispering words they themselves could barely believe. Every gaze in the church was fixed on Thomas, who now stood above the coffin, looking down without fear, almost as if he were observing a story being told about him rather than experiencing it firsthand. The weight of disbelief pressed down on the congregation, yet in that pressure there was a strange clarity. Life was unpredictable. Death could be delayed, rewritten, or denied. And for one soldier, it had been denied in the most spectacular, haunting way possible, by walking into the very ceremony prepared to bury him. Whispers turned to stutters, stutters to sighs, and sighs to awe. Faces remained white, yet the fear that had seized them slowly softened into something unnameable: relief, amazement, and a touch of fear still lingering at the edges. The city outside, fog-heavy and indifferent, seemed to pause in tandem with those within. London had witnessed a moment that would haunt its streets and churches for years to come. War had a way of distorting reality. Reports were brief, telegrams curt, and every detail subject to human error, or worse, assumption. In Thomas Avery's case, a single line in a report had sent ripples of grief across London. Private Thomas Avery killed in action. Body not recovered. Simple words, typed and transmitted with bureaucratic precision, yet carrying a lie that would haunt a city. The battlefield in France had been chaos. Smoke coiled over mud-soaked trenches, shells shattered the air, and screams of the wounded mingled with the commands of officers. Thomas had been struck, injured, and left behind as the unit retreated. He had crawled through the carnage, hidden among the dead, surviving by sheer will and desperation. Meanwhile, someone had assumed the worst, reported it, and sent the message across miles of land and sea to London. The report was unquestioned. Clerks, overworked and tired, entered his death into the ledger without verification. Officers, preoccupied with strategy and supply, offered no second glance. And London, far away and grieving, accepted it as truth. The report had become reality. A man alive was transformed into a ghost on paper. Back home, his family read the official words with trembling hands. Every neighbor's condolence, every whispered prayer, every black ribbon tied around the windows was now anchored in that false report. His mother, her heart heavy, had begun sewing black trims for her younger children. His father, stoic and silent, prepared to attend the funeral as a witness to a truth that did not exist. The war report had dictated sorrow. Thomas, meanwhile, fought against both the elements and the shadow of death. Each step toward England was a defiance of the reality crafted in ink and type. Each night spent in hiding, each encounter with strangers, was a reminder that survival required not just strength, but timing and luck. The report, unaware of his tenacity, had cast him into legend while he still drew breath. When he finally arrived in London, the weight of the false report met him at the church doors. The coffin awaited, the choirs sang, and the congregation grieved, all following the narrative dictated by a single line of text. The discrepancy between paper and flesh became undeniable as Thomas stepped into the building. Life had arrived to correct the record, but the shock it brought was almost too much to bear. Inside, the vicar's hands shook over his sermon notes. The choir faltered mid-hymn, and the family's eyes oscillated between disbelief and recognition. The war report that had promised finality now confronted the reality it could not contain. The man it declared dead was standing, alive, and very much present. Whispers spread through the church like wildfire. Some questioned their sanity. Others reached out to touch him, needing proof that flesh and blood could survive what paper had denied. The weight of the war report's lie hung heavily in the air, a reminder that bureaucracies, no matter how meticulous, could never truly govern life and death. Outside, the fog pressed against the church windows, silent witness to the miracle inside. London had been shown the fragility of words, the impermanence of reports, and the stubbornness of life itself. Thomas Avery, declared dead by a war report, had returned to remind the city that reality was never as simple as ink on paper. And for everyone present, that moment would linger. A confrontation with mortality, bureaucracy, and the impossible persistence of a man who refused to be erased. The army had rules. Rules about duty, honor, and above all, silence. Secrets were kept not only from the enemy, but sometimes from the families who awaited news with trembling hands. Thomas Avery's death was one such secret, born from miscommunication and compounded by the rigid codes of military protocol. In the weeks after the skirmish, the officers who reported him killed were certain of their duty. No body had been recovered. No one had seen him survive. In their eyes, The ledger and telegram were sufficient. To question them would be to undermine the authority of command. And so, the lie, unintended yet absolute, was cemented, carried across miles and oceans by the machinery of bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Thomas moved quietly through villages, forests, and abandoned tracks, avoiding soldiers who would have questioned his presence. Every interaction was delicate. A single word, a glance, or a misstep could reveal his existence and create a scandal. He had become a ghost in his own country, living by rules dictated not by law or morality, but by the rigid, unfeeling order of military silence. Back in London, his family had no choice but to obey the narrative handed to them. Condolences arrived from neighbors, letters of sympathy from distant relatives. Each visit reinforced the lie, each whispered prayer solidifying grief. No one could speak of hope too loudly, for fear of ridicule or disbelief. The military silence had extended beyond its barracks, shaping the city's mourning as much as the battlefield shaped his survival. When Thomas finally entered the church that day, he did more than shock the mourners. He broke the unspoken pact of silence that had ruled his life and death. Faces turned white, hands trembled, and hearts raced. For the first time, the secrecy imposed by authority was confronted by raw, undeniable reality, a man alive where none should have been. The vicar, who had relied on the official reports, had no choice but to stop speaking. Words that once offered comfort now seemed fragile against the weight of truth. The choir faltered again, notes hanging mid-air, as though unsure if they were permitted to continue. Even the congregation sensed the power of revelation. The rules that had governed life and death for weeks had been upended by a single act of courage, the act of surviving. Thomas's own silence spoke volumes. He did not chastise, explain, or apologize. He simply existed in contradiction, allowing those around him to reconcile shock with relief, grief with awe. Every glance he exchanged with family and friends conveyed what words could not. The battlefield had failed to end him, but the secrecy of authority had nearly broken the spirit of those who loved him. The military's secret, once buried in reports and ledgers, now lay exposed in the flickering candlelight of a Whitechapel church. It was a revelation not just of life, but of the human cost of silence, of the emotional toll borne by those forced to trust official declarations over instinct and love. Outside, the fog pressed closer against the church walls, a quiet witness to the unraveling of lies. London had glimpsed a truth both frightening and beautiful. The persistence of life, the fragility of authority, and the enduring weight of secrets kept too long. And for Thomas Avery, the soldier who had survived both war and bureaucracy, that day marked not only a return to life, but a confrontation with the invisible chains that had held his existence hostage for weeks. London is a city of memory. Streets carry whispers of history, buildings hold the weight of countless stories, and fog hides secrets that never fully fade. In Whitechapel, the tale of Thomas Avery became more than a personal miracle. It became a story the town could not forget. News spread quickly. Newspapers ran accounts, neighbors retold the story, and gossip traveled faster than the man himself ever could. He walked into his own funeral, they said, shaking heads in disbelief. Children repeated the tale at school, eyes wide with wonder. Adults debated the logistics, questioning the accuracy, but the emotional truth was undeniable. Life had intruded where death had been expected. Families who had witnessed the event carried it with them forever. Mothers whispered it to daughters. Fathers recounted it to sons. The story became a cautionary tale and a symbol of hope simultaneously. Life could defy expectation. The impossible could become reality. And yet, every retelling carried the weight of shock, the raw, unfiltered astonishment of those who had stared death in the face and found it empty. For Thomas, the city's memory was both comforting and haunting. People treated him with awe, respect, and sometimes fear. Wherever he went, the story preceded him, shaping interactions and reactions. Shopkeepers would pause mid-sentence, neighbors would offer quiet nods, and children would stare in wide-eyed fascination. London had rewritten him into legend while he was still alive, and no amount of normal life could erase it. Even years later, foggy streets and candlelit churches would recall that moment. Choirs remembered the unfinished hymn. Churches remembered the doors that had groaned under the weight of life reasserting itself. Families remembered the shock, the tears, and the overwhelming relief. It was as though the city itself refused to let the memory fade. Thomas's own family, once plunged into despair, became living reminders of resilience and disbelief. His mother never forgot the moment her son walked toward her, wet and exhausted, yet alive. His father's stoicism softened, tempered by gratitude and astonishment. Siblings grew up carrying the story as both a warning and a marvel, the fine line between life and death, and the strange power of human endurance. The tale spread beyond Whitechapel, whispered in pubs, printed in papers, and retold in private homes. Londoners spoke of it for decades, each retelling a thread in the fabric of urban legend. Some claimed to see him walking through foggy streets, boots clicking against stone, metals glinting faintly in dim light. Others swore they heard the echo of a hymn paused mid-verse whenever he passed by a church. And yet, for Thomas, the weight of the town's memory was double-edged. The miracle of survival brought fame, but it also brought scrutiny, expectation, and an unspoken reminder that life could be cruelly fragile. Every step he took was watched, every word interpreted, every glance remembered. He had returned to a city that would never allow him the quiet passage of ordinary life again. London had witnessed the impossible, and it had chosen not to forget. For the townspeople, Thomas Avery's return was a story stitched into the very streets, a reminder of the unpredictable, unyielding nature of life, and the enduring shock of seeing a man rise from death's shadow and reclaim his place among the living. After the shock of the funeral, life resumed, yet nothing was ever quite ordinary for Thomas Avery. The city had seen him defy death, and the world had adjusted its perception of him. He walked the same streets he had known before the war, but every glance, every whisper, every nod reminded him that he was both celebrated and scrutinized, a living man whose return had become legend. The army offered no explanation, no restitution for the error. Bureaucracy remained rigid, indifferent to the emotional toll it had exacted. Thomas returned his papers, claimed his medals, and lived quietly, yet his survival was always a story that shadowed him. Letters arrived from strangers who had heard of the event, people seeking to grasp the impossible or to touch the man who had walked into his own funeral. His family, though joyous at first, learned that the miracle carried a weight of its own. Each conversation, each simple act of daily life, was haunted by the memory of grief turned to disbelief. Meals shared, letters written, even walks in foggy London streets were reminders that life could be rewritten in an instant, and that the ledger of death, the telegrams, and the church doors could never be ignored again. Thomas's nights were restless. Dreams carried him back to France, to the battlefield that had first declared him dead. He saw the smoke, the mud, the cries of men lost and found. He awoke in candlelit rooms to the soft sounds of the city, to the distant clatter of horses on cobblestones, to whispers of neighbors who remembered that day. Even survival could not erase the shadows of war. Yet, he learned to navigate this strange existence. He walked with careful composure, knowing that his every movement might be watched, analyzed, whispered about. He spoke little of the funeral, rarely recounted the moment he opened the church doors. The city had its memory, and he had his own private reckoning. Survival had given him life, but had also made him a ghost among the living, seen by all yet known fully by none. Time passed, and the story became legend. Children who had seen him as a boy whispered of the man who returned. Choirs recalled the hymn interrupted. Churches preserved the story of the doors that had groaned under impossibility. Scholars, Writers and curious travelers would occasionally recount the tale, fascinated by the collision of life and death, of bureaucracy and fate. And Thomas, quietly, continued to live, not as an ordinary man, but as a symbol of resilience, survival, and the fragile, unpredictable dance between mortality and chance. Despite the legend, despite the awe and wonder, he remained human. He loved, he feared, he grew old. The shadows of that foggy London morning never left him, and he carried them like a second uniform, a reminder of the fine line he had walked between life and oblivion. Friends, family, and strangers all witnessed him, but none could fully inhabit the experience of living on the threshold between death and the world he had fought to re-enter. And so, Thomas Avery's life continued, not in quiet obscurity, but as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. A soldier who had been written dead, who walked into his own funeral, and who survived to live a life watched, whispered about, and remembered forever. London, the city of fog, shadows, and history, would never forget the day that life intruded upon death so dramatically. And Thomas, for the rest of his days, remained a man shaped by that moment, a ghost among the living, carrying both the weight and the wonder of a world that had once mourned him too soon.